Hello and welcome to the 9th day of the 2025 TooFatLardies Advent Calendar, and it's time to get your trousers on because you're nicked, as Dave Brown is here to tell us more.
Hello, welcome to the next window in this year's TooFatLardies Advent Calendar for 2025. Now, behind this window lies an inquiring question from the TooFatLardies. They ask the following: what aspect of your rules do you think people overlook that could improve their gameplay? Well, the most obvious rule that comes to mind is the reserve rules, be that a reserve brigade, reserve battalion, or even a reserve company. The holding back of a section of an army, division or battalion as a reserve has been a fundamental military tactic for centuries. Those commanders that neglected to hold a reserve often came unstuck, while commanders holding a reserve could meet new threats or exploit new situations with these reserves and use them to ensure victory. For instance, Caesar used his reserve legionaries at the Battle of Pharsalus against Pompey to prevent Pompey's cavalry turning his flank. Napoleon's use of reserves hardly need be commented upon, but the fact he held his best troops, and significant numbers of them in reserve in the form of the Imperial Guard, and often heavy cavalry reserves, meant he could react to almost any situation, or use them as the final attack to secure victory, as he did on many an occasion. Indeed, right up to World War II, commanders held reserves, from corps level all the way down to company and platoon level. The classic British 2 up, 1 back deployment reveals how reserves are now deeply embedded in the British Army doctrine, and still are. And this is why reserves receive so much attention in my rules, as I try to emphasise that in battle reserves are vital to achieving victory or staving off defeat. However, many previous rule sets seem to ignore this vital tenet of military history, or just simply gave scant regard to reserves. With some rules, holding a reserve had no real point. They couldn't add firepower or melee advantages, and when they eventually entered the tabletop, they always came on at the rear table edge. They were then forced to inch forwards, taking numerous turns before they even reached the front line. And by that time their impact was too late, or so obvious to the opponent that he had had plenty of time, a lot of time, to shift forces to meet the new threat. This is hardly something that Caesar, Napoleon or Montgomery would have recognised. Hence, reserves in rules such as General d'Armée and O Group are treated very differently. Often, new players do not initially realise the sheer value of holding a reserve and deploying them to turn a battle in their favour. Perhaps it's the impact of these previous rule sets that cause a reluctance to hold units off table as reserves, and it can often take at least 1 or 2 games to overcome this reticence before players catch on and then start deploying reserves with all the cunning of a Hannibal or a Rommel. So if we first look at the use of reserves in General d'Armée, the player holding reserve gains a distinct advantage. This is because he can keep fresh troops out of harm's way, ready to launch that decisive blow when needed. On deploying a reserve, there is the potential to deploy these troops very quickly to a critical point on the tabletop, putting them in a position to strike a decisive blow before the enemy can react. This impact is further enhanced if a player uses the commit the reserves commander-in-chief tasking. This enables the player to bring on his reserves anywhere along his rear table edge with increased movement. This can completely outfox your opponent, who, now struggling to reposition due to this surprise assault, could well present you with an opportunity to win the game. O Group does much the same thing with its reserves, permitting a player to deploy these forces in a number of different ways. Reserves can be deployed on your combat patrols. What are combat patrols? Well, these represent small reconnaissance or fighting patrols sent out by each side and are represented on the tabletop by small markers. These are difficult to engage and represent both a threat and a distraction to the opponent. Why a threat? Well, because clever use of combat patrols in infiltrating and outflanking your opponent's positions allows a player to subsequently deploy reserve infantry platoons or heavy weapons directly from these combat patrols across the flank or to the rear of the enemy, giving you a marked advantage. In one game, I can recall a player who outflanked Tiger Tank that was holding up the advance of a British battalion with a combat patrol. The player then cleverly deployed a Piat team from this combat patrol to fire at the flank of the Tiger, succeeding in damaging the vehicle and subsequently changing the outcome of the game. In addition, players also have at their disposal the consolidation order, which permits gamers to bring on infantry or armour reserves deep into the battlefield, taking advantage of positions gained by your first wave units. The use of armour consolidation can prove particularly effective, as suddenly your opponent is presented with an enemy armour concentration positioned well forward on the battlefield. In both General Dame and O Group, players should endeavour to force their opponent to commit their last reserve before you commit yours. By doing so, you can ensure that your reserves cannot be countered by fresh troops, and they will have significant impact on arrival. Remember, he who holds the last reserve and commits it at the right place and at the right time will most likely emerge victorious. As Napoleon said, Providence is always on the side of the last reserve, and one shouldn't argue with him. So although often overlooked, reserves in war games can be just as important as those reserves held back in the actual battles of military history. They bring an added tactical depth and enjoyment to our games.